In a neighborhood crafted to embody quiet uniformity, where lawns were trimmed with military precision and every porch bore nearly identical flower pots, the arrival of something different was bound to cause friction. For years, the area had been a sanctuary for rules, an enclave where the homeowners association dictated everything, from the shade of beige a house could be painted to how long a trash can was allowed to sit by the curb. The neighbors had grown accustomed to their rigid code of order, accepting that compliance was the price of membership in this carefully curated bubble. Then came the chickens. The homeowner had brought them in quietly, beginning with only a few hens. To him, they were not just animals, but a small step towards self-sufficiency, a way to reconnect with something natural amidst a landscape built on conformity. He constructed a modest coop in his backyard, tucked neatly near the fence line, and stocked it with clean bedding, sturdy wire, and fresh feed. Each morning, he collected eggs, warm and fresh, and found joy in a simple routine that reminded him of a slower, steadier life beyond the HOA's grasp. For a while, no one seemed to notice. The hens clucked softly, scratching the soil and pecking at insects. They made little noise compared to barking dogs or weekend lawnmowers. Some neighbors even admired them from a distance, charmed by the novelty of backyard chickens in an otherwise sterile environment. But in neighborhoods where rules were king, it took only one person to decide that something ordinary had become an abomination. That person was Karen. She lived directly behind the homeowner's property, her yard bordering the fence where the coop sat. Known across the subdivision for her relentless complaints, she saw herself not just as a resident, but as the guardian of standards. She prided herself on her role as watchdog, monitoring every detail of the community and filing formal complaints about anything she deemed out of place. A basketball hoop left too long in a driveway, a wreath not approved for the season, even a mailbox flag that seemed too bright. She was never shy about reporting it to the HOA. When she spotted the hens through a gap in her hedges, her outrage ignited. To her, the birds were not just chickens, they were an invasion, a threat to the pristine uniformity of the neighborhood. She began complaining immediately. First to the board, then to neighbors, and finally through letters and photos attached to official violation notices. She cited rules about livestock, claimed they were unsanitary, and warned that property values would plummet. To anyone listening, she described the chickens as if they were a plague. The HOA board, already familiar with her constant stream of grievances, took her seriously enough to investigate. They sent notices to the homeowner, insisting the animals violated community covenants. The language was formal but firm, warning that fines would be levied if the hens remained. The homeowner, however, knew better. He had researched the city ordinances long before bringing the chickens home. Municipal code explicitly permitted a small number of backyard hens as long as they were properly contained, clean, and did not include roosters. His setup complied perfectly. The HOA might have wanted to erase individuality, but they could not override the law. The letters kept coming anyway. Karen doubled down, escalating her campaign. She attended board meetings armed with photos of feathers scattered in the grass, recordings of clucks that she exaggerated into shrieks, and dire predictions of disease and vermin. She painted the chickens as chaos incarnate, a threat to the entire neighborhood's peaceful way of life. And yet, day after day, the chickens remained. They laid their eggs, fluffed their feathers, and carried on as if oblivious to the storm gathering around them. But while the hens were unbothered, the tension between neighbors began to thicken. Conversations grew sharper at mailboxes and sidewalks. Some rolled their eyes at Karen's obsession, whispering about her need to control everyone else's lives. Others, fearing conflict, quietly sided with her, repeating her warnings about falling property values. The board sat in the middle, overwhelmed by the growing drama, but reluctant to admit their inability to enforce what Karen demanded. The homeowner, meanwhile, felt a shift inside himself. At first, the chickens had been for personal enjoyment, a hobby with practical benefits. Now, as the complaints mounted, they became something more, a line he refused to let Karen or the HOA cross. The hens represented independence, a refusal to be crushed under arbitrary rules, and the right to live without every choice filtered through Karen's approval. So when the HOA mailed another violation notice with increasing threats of fines, he decided to push back, not quietly, but in a way that would send a message. If Karen hated the chickens enough to demand their removal, then perhaps she could learn to live with them even closer. Perhaps the best way to handle her endless interference was not to hide the coop, but to place it exactly where her complaints would echo the loudest. He began to plan adjustments to the backyard, moving pieces around, reworking the coop's position. As boards hammered and wire stretched, a new reality was forming, one that Karen would not be able to ignore. The first chapter of this conflict was nearing its close. The HOA had declared war over the chickens. Karen had turned them into her personal obsession, but the homeowner was done bending, and his next move would escalate the battle in a way that neither Karen nor the HOA could have anticipated. The war over chickens had begun, and it was only just getting started. When the homeowner made the decision to reposition his chickens' coop, it was not done impulsively. Every movement of the boards, every post driven into the ground, every nail hammered into wood, carried intention. He had endured weeks of relentless pressure, violation letters, sour-whispered gossip, and Karen's shrill complaints echoing through the neighborhood. If the HOA and Karen believed they could push him into submission, then they had underestimated how far his resolve would stretch. The new location for the coop was carefully chosen. No longer would it sit quietly at the far end of his backyard, politely hidden behind shrubs and trees. Instead, he shifted it closer, aligning it directly against the shared fence line, and more specifically, positioning it just opposite the windows of Karen's home. From her kitchen, from her patio, from the bedroom she so proudly displayed during community tours, Karen would see the coop each time she looked outside. The hens would become part of her daily view, a reminder of the fight she had ignited. The work was deliberate. The homeowner reinforced the structure, ensuring it complied with every possible ordinance. He cleaned the coop meticulously, spread fresh straw, and installed secure wiring. He even added a roofed run, giving the hens space to scratch and wander without the risk of escape. Everything was up to code, every detail unimpeachable. There would be no grounds for the HOA to claim neglect or hazard. If they wanted a reason to force removal, they would have to fabricate one. Once the hens settled into their new roost, the change in atmosphere was immediate. Their gentle clucking carried across the fence line, their soft rustling more audible now that they were positioned so close to Karen's property. In the early mornings, as the sun lifted and the hens stirred, their sounds filtered directly into Karen's open windows. What once had been background noise, faint and ignorable, now became her personal alarm clock. Karen's reaction was predictable. Outrage returned with renewed ferocity. She stormed into HOA meetings with fresh photos of the coop's new location, demanding urgent action. She described the hens as a deliberate provocation, accusing the homeowner of harassment. She insisted that the coop violated community spirit and stretched the definitions of nuisance to their breaking point. The board listened, but their frustration was clear. While they may have shared her dislike for the chickens, they could not deny that every element of the setup remained legal. The homeowner, for his part, continued his quiet defiance. Each morning, he went about his routine, scattering feed, refreshing water, and collecting eggs. The hens thrived in their new spot, enjoying more sunlight and protection from the wind. Their feathers gleamed, their combs stood bright and healthy, and their clucks resonated like tiny victories. As the weeks wore on, the neighborhood itself began to fracture under the weight of the dispute. Some residents, weary of Karen's constant crusades, grew amused by the situation. They chuckled at the irony that her own complaints had made the chickens a more prominent feature of her life. Others, fearful of drawing her ire, avoided the topic entirely, sidestepping conversations about the growing conflict. And then there were those who quietly admired the homeowner's determination, finding in his defiance a kind of courage they themselves lacked. Karen, however, could not let it go. The chickens consumed her attention. Every morning she awoke not to silence, but to the sound of clucking that seemed, in her mind, louder than any dog's bark or child's laugh. Every afternoon, she peered through her blinds, watching the hens scratch the dirt with what she interpreted as mocking persistence. Every evening she sent another email or letter to the HOA, escalating her descriptions, painting the homeowner as a menace. But while Karen seethed, the homeowner prospered. The eggs became a point of connection. Neighbors who had once been indifferent began to stop by, curious about the hens. He shared cartons with those who asked, each dozen eggs forming small bonds of goodwill. Slowly, quietly he built allies. Where Karen saw chaos, others began to see charm. Where she saw nuisance, others tasted omelettes, quiches, and fresh breakfasts that store shelves could not replicate. The board grew increasingly uneasy. Their authority, once unquestioned, was being tested by the chickens in ways they had never expected. The rules so often wielded as weapons against minor deviations now faltered under the weight of legal reality. They could not force removal. They could not fine without cause. They could not appease Karen without overstepping their bounds. Each new demand from her only highlighted their impotence. And so the war reached a stalemate. Karen screamed into the void of rules that would not bend, while the homeowner went about his days with quiet, deliberate victory. But the stalemate was fragile, and beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The homeowner knew Karen well enough to understand she would not give up. She had too much pride invested, too much identity tied to her self-appointed role as enforcer of the neighborhood's standards. To lose meant admitting she had no power, and that was something Karen could not accept. It was only a matter of time before she tried something drastic, and when she did, the chickens would be ready. By the time the third month of the conflict arrived, the neighborhood had settled into a strange routine. The homeowner's chickens clucked happily by the fence, their coop standing strong and immaculately maintained. The homeowner himself walked with a newfound calmness, his confidence unshaken despite constant scrutiny. But on the other side of the property line, Karen's life had become a slow-motion unraveling. The chickens were no longer just birds in a backyard. To Karen, they had become a symbol of humiliation, a daily reminder that she had failed to exert control. Their clucks, soft and harmless to most, had grown in her imagination into sharp jeers, as though the birds themselves mocked her defeat. Each morning, when the hens stirred with the rising sun, Karen awoke not to peace but to agitation. Their sounds broke her rest, and her frustrations simmered before the day even began. Her anger began to consume her identity. At HOA meetings, her speeches stretched longer. Her voice rose higher, and her accusations grew wilder. She spoke of sleepless nights, of a property ruined, of her rights trampled by a neighbor who had turned poultry into a weapon. The board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, reluctant to admit what was obvious, that there was no violation, no breach, nothing actionable. Still, they tried to appease her, promising to look into it, though they all knew there was nothing left to investigate. Karen's obsession didn't stop at the meetings. She began keeping records, logs of when the chickens clucked, photographs of the coop at different hours of the day, even videos of hens pecking at the dirt. She sent these files to the HOA board, to the county clerk, even to local animal control. Each recipient glanced at the evidence, shrugged, and filed it away. The birds were legal. The homeowner was compliant. The complaints were hollow. The homeowner, meanwhile, continued to live as though nothing had changed. He nurtured his flock, collected fresh eggs, and shared them with neighbors. Word spread about his hens, and slowly, a quiet current of support grew around him. Families stopped by to visit, their children peering over the fence to marvel at the fluffy birds scratching in the dust. Elderly neighbors found joy in receiving cartons of eggs. What Karen framed as nuisance, others experienced as novelty. The chickens were no longer a controversy. They were becoming a feature of the community. But Karen could not see this shift. To her, every friendly interaction with the chickens was an act of betrayal. She watched neighbors laugh with the homeowner, carry away baskets of eggs, and smile at the hens, and she seethed. Her narrative of suffering, of being the victim of a neighborhood menace, was collapsing around her. The more support the homeowner gained, the more isolated Karen became. It was in this isolation that she made her fateful mistake. One late evening, under the cover of dusk, Karen marched to the fence line. She carried a ladder, gloves, and a plan she thought would end the battle once and for all. The chickens were quiet, roosting in their coop, unaware of the storm approaching. Karen's intent was clear. She would remove the problem herself. Whether through intimidation, relocation, or worse, she wanted the birds gone. But what she failed to account for was the vigilance of her neighbors. Months of drama had drawn eyes to the conflict, and more than a few residents had begun quietly recording Karen's behavior. As she scaled the ladder and leaned into the homeowner's yard, cameras clicked on from porches and windows. The image of Karen, HOA board member and self-appointed enforcer, caught trespassing under cover of night, became the final nail in her campaign. When the footage spread the next morning, the neighborhood erupted. Karen's credibility collapsed instantly. She had not only broken the rules she so loudly claimed to defend, but she had done so in a way that exposed her obsession to the world. Her attempt to play the role of protector of the community had crumbled into farce. The HOA board could no longer ignore her behavior. For months they had tolerated her complaints, but trespassing was indefensible. Formal action was taken. Karen was removed from her position as board president. Her authority, once so domineering, evaporated overnight. Where she had once spoken with power, now she muttered excuses to a community that had grown tired of her crusade. Meanwhile, the homeowners' chickens thrived more than ever. Their story, fueled by the viral footage, spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local news outlets picked up the saga, framing it as the tale of a stubborn homeowner, an overbearing neighbor, and a flock of hens that had unwittingly toppled an HOA giant. The homeowner himself never sought fame, but it found him all the same. He was invited to speak about urban farming, about property rights, about standing firm in the face of pressure. His hens became minor celebrities, their photos circulating online, their clucks recognized as the soundtrack of a viral sensation. And Karen, she was left to live with the very thing she had fought so hard to destroy. Each morning as the sun rose, the chickens clucked awake, their sounds carrying clearly into her windows. She no longer had the platform to complain, no longer had the authority to demand action. The co-op stood firm, protected not only by the law, but by the goodwill of the community. The hens had become untouchable, their presence secured by the very spectacle Karen had created. Her punishment was poetic. The birds she had tried to silence became her permanent alarm clock, their voices louder than ever in her mind. What began as a nuisance transformed into a daily reminder of her downfall. Each cluck, each feathered rustle, each morning egg symbolized the power she had lost. The homeowner, meanwhile, carried on with quiet satisfaction. He had never asked for war, never sought confrontation. All he wanted was the right to keep his chickens in peace. Yet, through patience and determination, he had gained far more than that. He had won not only his battle, but the respect of his neighbors, the admiration of strangers, and a legacy that would outlast the clamor of HOA politics. The neighborhood itself changed as well. The HOA, humbled by the ordeal, grew cautious in its enforcement. No longer did it wield its rules like weapons. Instead, it shifted to a quieter, more collaborative approach. The memory of Karen's downfall lingered as a warning of what happened when authority was abused. And so the story reached its ironic conclusion. Karen, who wanted silence, awoke each morning to clucks she could not escape. The homeowner, who wanted peace, found himself with allies he never expected. And the chickens, simple creatures unaware of the storm they had weathered, continued to scratch, peck, and lay eggs in the sunlight. Living symbols of resilience, persistence, and poetic justice. The battle had ended, not with the silence Karen demanded, but with the chorus of hens greeting each dawn.